The Denver Broncos wrapped up their final practice, a mandatory minicamp, and the offense wasn't sharp for most of the quarterbacks throughout the day. We'll tell you what we saw and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you once again for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day, wherever you get your podcast, or if you watch us on YouTube, do us a favor, subscribe or follow if you have not done so already, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite NFL team every single day, all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. I cover the team in person daily in the Valley, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. Check out his written work over there. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. The Broncos have officially wrapped up mandatory minicamp. We'll dive a little bit deeper into the dynamics of that here, but really, for the final practice that we had a chance to see on Wednesday in Dove Valley, the one thing that we noticed that the Broncos offense, which has been pretty steady and consistent for the most part this entire offseason, looked a little bit human, and Bo Nix got his opportunity to lead the first team offense. It wasn't the sharpest day for Bo Nix, Zach Wilson, and at times Jarrett Stidham, but the Broncos offense overall didn't have a lot of flow to it in the final practice before training camp. Not too much to read into it, but obviously interesting considering the trend that we've been seeing so far. I think it's good for the quarterbacks to have a day like this in particular, because remember, we go back to Case Keenum in 2018, didn't throw a single interception in training camp, and then all of a sudden didn't have a great regular season overall. Like, couldn't miss in training camp. We know how that season ended there. But for the Broncos, I feel like they put together a large body of work this offseason. It just didn't come to I'd say a sharp conclusion at mandatory minicamp on Wednesday.
And that's not always going to be the case, is it, right? Where even for Sean Payton, who's an offensive guy, I mean, he's not just going to say, all right, we got to have that other additional practice that we were planning on just because I need the offense to at least have another shot to go in on a high note. I mean, it is, like you said, Cody, the body of work. And what's really encouraging is hearing not just Sean Payton, but even offensive coordinator Joe Lombardi, who we finally got a chance to hear from after Wednesday's practice, and talking about how, man, Bo Nix doesn't feel like a rookie at all. He's basically said, like, you can feel the 61 starts that he had at the college level when he's out there. And so I think it's ultimately still encouraging. I know there was the interception out there at practice. Look, guys, quarterbacks throw interceptions at practice. It's not that big of a deal. Like you said, with Case Keenum, didn't throw an interception all season. I remember the very first game that year against the Seahawks, I think he threw three interceptions in that game. So you just never know. And that kind of stuff happens in practice. So it's nothing really to read into. And from what I read from your practice report, Cody, it sounded like it was kind of just a tipped ball in the air anyway. Maybe you can help describe that a little better. But ultimately, I don't think anything to worry about. And I think even if the offense ended, mandatory minicamp with not their best day, I think ultimately it's like you said, that whole body of work that's really encouraging about that particular unit going into maybe the dog days of the offseason now.
Yeah, and I'll walk you through the interception there by Bo Nix, obviously his first interception of the offseason program, and everyone read it and they're like, oh my gosh, interception here. So I want to break it down for you. This was in the team 7-on-7 period that they had. Bo obviously getting the first 4 reps of that period with the starting unit, was going in coverage. This was against Michael Bandy was running a route here, and Bandy did a great job of breaking it down. But Levi Wallace, obviously a veteran savvy cornerback here in the National Football League, a lot of experience, read the route really well. Bo threw the ball on the inside shoulder where it needed to be. And obviously Michael Bandy's a little bit of a shorter guy here, and Levi Wallace is a little bit of a longer length guy. And I thought Levi did a really good job on, this is what we talk about when we coach up defensive backs. He got his, he got his hip around he got his hand around the hip of the defender, then brought his ball side hand forward, made an aggressive push to really try to get through the hands, play through the hands of Michael Bandy, who's obviously shorter, not as long, had a little bit of advantage there. And it tipped the ball up in the air, popped the ball up in the air, and then he corralled it in for an interception. It wasn't like Bo Nix was dropping back there and he was looking to throw and the guy wasn't there and he just threw a direct interception. This was more of a, hey, this is a tipped opportunity by the defense. They made a play on it. And look, stuff like that is going to happen. And there are going to be times in the regular season and maybe even in the preseason where Bo, and even training camp, where Bo throws a direct interception. Not going to read too much into it overall. I think quarterbacks, for the most part, really have done a good job during OTAs, a mandatory minicamp, of protecting the football. Zach had one interception during OTAs. He had another interception in the final week of OTAs where he threw it to PJ Locke off his back foot. Some things you want to clean up from him, but not necessarily going to overreact to interceptions here in practice like it happens all the time, even in the regular season. We just can't report on it, or else people would freak out or like, oh my gosh, Russell Wilson threw an interception during practice during the regular season. They should just move on. For like, that would have put gasoline to the fire there. I will say this, though, in terms of big body work, this was a shorter practice because the first day of mandatory minicamp, they had a 7-on-7 period. They had 3 team periods, and then they had a little bit of a skilly period to end practice. They only had 1 team period, 7-on-7, and then they had a red zone period to end practice. And I will say in the red zone period, Jarrett Stidham, working with the 3rd team offensive unit, had the most productive day in that regard. He found Blake Watson on a quick dump out for a touchdown during that period. And then you saw him throw a pass to Troy Franklin to really end practice there. So Stidham, steady once again, pretty sharp on the day. But for the most part in team period, when we're talking about Jarrett Stidham in the last 2 days of mandatory minicamp, a lot of his primary pass catchers have been running backs. Day 1 of mandatory minicamp, 7 of his 12 passes went to running backs out of the backfield or on route there. So, I mean, you're finding consistency, you're finding work with it. But like I said, right now, this is just a small body of work for these QBs that are all going to report here. I think July 23rd is going to be training camp. I think that's going to be the start of the 23rd or the 24th. And then they're going to move forward here. But as we all know, the quarterbacks getting together with wide receivers shortly after the 4th of July. It's a good sign there.
Yeah, they'll take a couple weeks here to kind of recharge and maybe mix a little football and training with a little kind of just, I don't know, unplugging a little bit. Go and do your thing. If you want to take a little summer vacation, I'm sure this is the time when most guys end up doing that. I know head coach Sean Payton said he's going to be golfing every day. So there's a mixture of football and you know, not football that happens around this time. But I think overall, Cody, just based on what you've told us that you've seen out there and what other reports have said, I think just an encouraging offseason for the quarterback position. Like we kind of talked at the end of last regular season that, and we really want to see the Broncos invest in that position and dive headfirst into a 1st-round quarterback. They did that, and it seems like he's as advertised. I mean, Bo Nix was, lauded for his experience, for his accuracy, for his kind of poise and charisma and, quiet lead by example type of nature. I just feel like he's really stepped in and met the expectations that anyone had, maybe exceeding for a lot of people. And I think that should give Broncos country a lot of confidence going into this, this dead portion of the offseason where he is going to be getting work with Cortland Sutton and the veteran receivers who, like you mentioned on yesterday's episode, Tim Patrick looking really good. And a couple of days before that, like Josh Reynolds having a good offseason, Marvin Mims looking good. We know he's got the chemistry with Troy Franklin. So like those guys working together is going to be outstanding to be able to hear and see about. I hope we get a chance to see maybe some clips of whatever they end up doing. But I overall seem very encouraged by what everyone is saying about these quarterbacks as of right now.
Yeah, and I would say once again, just the overall collective thought, I think Jarrett Stidham and Bo Nix have been the 2 quarterbacks that have looked the sharpest consistently from OTAs to minicamp. Zach Wilson still trying to find his footing a little bit, which I don't think is a negative against him. I think it's going to hurt him. I think that there's a real scenario. These 3 quarterbacks are on the roster in 2024. Now, one being on the practice squad. I do think that Zach Wilson will more than likely be the Broncos practice squad quarterback this season. But look, now training camp is coming up. It's another opportunity for him once the pads come on. What are we going to see? That's what we're excited about. But we won't find out really till the start of training camp, which is now the next thing that we're looking forward to. The Broncos, they have wrapped up minicamp after just 2 days of practices. What was Sean Payton's vibe from the overall offseason program? We'll break that down and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And Game Time makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and even easier because prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer that it gets to tip off. And with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. Not only can you get NBA Finals tickets, you can get concert tickets. For example, if you're in the Denver area, Zach Bryan's playing on Friday and Saturday night. Game Time gives you exclusive access to get the best deals on tickets inside the app. Morgan Wallen's in a couple of weeks. If you're like that, you can get involved in that. And plus, when the Broncos season starts, you can get tickets to Broncos games all inside the Game Time app with last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. All-in pricing where you toggle that feature and it'll show you your total up front so you don't get surprised with any fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton is feeling the good vibes of a young roster this offseason, and you can feel it. And he had some interesting analogies that he shared after practice, and Cody and I will break down kind of his vibe and where coach is feeling like maybe he's a little more confident this year as opposed to last year on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you who make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, wherever and however you listen to podcasts. And hey, if you subscribe to the show on YouTube, you get us jumping at the top of your algorithm every single day. And you know what you could do if you're on YouTube? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today for any of the national coverage that you want. There's no localized anything with national coverage. You get local experts, though, with Locked On Sports Today, which is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that's programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without any of that national coverage that you don't need or want. And Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, news, and it's streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channel app, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's talk about Sean Payton's vibe a little bit here as we head into the portion of the offseason where it gets a little bit challenging for football fans. They're hungry for football now. We've been hearing all these updates lately and getting to see the guys out there on the field. Now you got to wait a little over a month and a half or so until training camp begins. But I think it's great to see Sean Payton feeling the way that he is, Cody. You can tell that he's more comfortable this year, and he's got maybe a rejuvenated energy about him. I don't know that you could directly attribute it to the roster, but I'm interested in your perspective about this because you're at the media scrums, you're at the press conferences and things like that. That's the vibe that I'm picking up. What are you feeling with Sean Payton as far as just kind of where he's at in terms of his vibe with the team right now?
I mean, it seems like a lot of where Sean is at has been on the enthusiastic side. I mean, I want to try to put myself in his shoes here for a minute. When we go back to last season, okay, you take a year off, you retire from coaching, you do a Fox gig, and all of a sudden you get that itch like, man, I miss football. I want to go coach again. But then it's like, what situation is good for me? Well, he goes through the process, goes through the interviews, meets with several teams, and then figures out like, okay, hey, I feel like Denver is the place I want to go. And for all of us, we're like, how's that dynamic going to work with him and Russell Wilson? And so obviously it was something where Sean said, hey, look, we're going to play his greatest hits. We're going to come in. There were a lot of dirty hands as to like what happened in 2022. That's not all on Russell Wilson. And so I think the vibe coming into mandatory minicamp last year, going into training camp, it was a little bit mysterious, right? And for Sean, it's like, all right, hey, I'm getting back into the coaching groove. Like you take a year away from coaching, it still takes some time to get some of that back. Like he was a guy who was doing it consistently for years after years. You get away from that routine. It's like all of a sudden it's like, I miss it. How do I get back to it? And we saw Sean self-admittedly do a lot of self-scouting last year and say, I could have done this better. I could have done this better. I think overall coming into this offseason, with all the moves that they made, including moving on from Russell Wilson and going through and saying, this is my first real true offseason to get fully ingrained in the process with the scouting department, with George, and also to build for the NFL draft. We have more capital this year. He mentioned it during the final mandatory minicamp practice. He went through all the rookie class guys that he had talked about, and he mentioned that, for Troy Franklin, they had a round 2 grade on him. For Jonah Ellis, they had a round 2 grade on him. Like they got these guys a little bit higher than they had graded out. And I think that's a good sign. Like he's optimistic about the young guys he's brought in. He even mentioned the undrafted rookie free agents, the free agent signings. But more importantly, I feel like he's got a roster right now that is carrying out the things that he wants to do. He's more comfortable coming into his second year as a head coach in a new area with a bigger media scene like the New Orleans Beats. Obviously not that big in terms of how many people they're actively covering practice. So that's also a thing. So I would say, like, in terms of Sean, his energy, his enthusiasm, it's been great. A night and day difference in comparison to last year. And he's also been pretty good to us media folks. We got better access, better views to be able to get good footage and obviously insight as to what's going on when they're in team period. So I think a lot of that starts with Sean and where he's at, but more importantly, what he had told us is the reason why he canceled the third and final day of minicamp practice. He felt like the collective body of work from these guys, offensively, defensively, special teams, it was impressive enough. It was clean. It was consistent. And he wanted to give some of these guys time off because the real grind is going to start here around July 23rd when training camp begins. And from that point forward, it's 110% full speed, hopefully through the month of February.
I thought it was really funny listening to Sean Payton talk at his press conference, as you mentioned all those things that you did, which was really exciting to hear. And, you know, he was asked specifically about what is different this year than last year. Because last year, I mean, I don't want to use the word curmudgeon because he wasn't like that, but you could tell, I mean, there was a little bit of a fire underneath him. Like,
yeah,
it was all business. There was no, you know, no nonsense sort of thing. And I'm not saying there's nonsense or like it's a little lackadaisical or anything, but the energy is way different. He said, you know, maybe last year, I thought this was a hilarious quote. He's like, last year I was guilty of, let's say, peeing on trees. You know how dogs go and they mark their territory. You're on a walk or you're in your backyard or whatever. They're marking territory. He's comparing what last year that was like for him. He's like, I'm peeing on all the trees, and you're spending time kind of trying to like put your stamp or put your mark on everything, right? And he did have to invest a lot in that, because what was the question this time a year ago? The question this time a year ago was, how are you going to change the culture of this team to get them to be a winning organization again? And that is what is required. You have to go and say, all right, I don't like how we're doing things here. This is how I do things, and this is how we're going to do it moving forward. And that can rub a lot of people wrong in any organization when you bring a new leader like that in. But look, this is a guy that's been there, done that, and he's worthy of the respect. I know there's a lot of debate amongst Broncos fans about that, of like, does Sean Payton deserve that kind of respect, or was he carried in New Orleans by Drew Brees and you know, all these different things. Like, I feel like he's definitely earned that right, in my opinion, Cody, to be able to go and say, I'm going to put my stamp on this. I'm going to put my mark on this. And now that he's not having to do that, he's able to lead in a completely different way. He's not leading from the vantage point of, I'm the one in charge. This is how we're doing things from now on. He's now able to lead from the vantage point of, hey, let's work together. Let's develop the talent. Let's put together this plan. Let's do this. It's just a different vibe completely. And I think what he described is exactly what it is.
Well, and another thing that I've noticed so far, at least just in OTAs and mandatory minicamp, Sean is letting his coaches coach. Like, he's entrusted Davis Webb with the quarterbacks. He's entrusted passing game coordinator Johnny Moe, or, you know, Johnny Morton, is, you know, everyone calls him, all the players call him Coach Johnny Moe. Very intense guy, by the way. Like, I mean, we can't say certain things in terms of what we hear in between like player coach dialogue, but this is a guy who's fired up and holds guys' feet to the fire in terms of accountability. If they don't run their route at the correct depth, like, it's intricate, attention to detail type of stuff there. But Sean is letting his guys coach. He's letting Joe Lombardi coach. And when Sean has to step in and coach guys up, he's obviously doing that as needed. But he is entrusting his coaches around him, which I think is a great sign in terms of the team taking a step in the right direction maybe this year. I mean, as bad as they looked last year, they won 8 games, right? After starting off 1-5. So now if you have a lot of confidence and enthusiasm, you have really good depth right now, which I think the team has really good depth across the board at a lot of positions. Is some of it unproven talent? Absolutely. But they are going in the right direction here. And I think Sean is very excited about the possibilities that could come. And look, maybe if it doesn't lead to a lot of, you know, more wins this year, there seems to be a vibe and a feeling in place that, hey, like, we are building something special, hopefully for the future. Even if it doesn't happen in 2024, they're on the right path there. And I think that's something that Sean believes. And so he's got a little more pep in his step. He's got some more jabs and some funniness he's going to throw out. Like you mentioned, the pissing on trees analogy. And then he told us, you know, he has 2 middle fingers. He knows how to use them well when talking about like the national media narrative and like, you know, what is your like perspective on maybe giving everyone a middle finger for like the doubt and all the criticism. And he says, I'm not as worried about that stuff anymore as I used to be. So it just seems like he's in a better headspace. I mean, you mentioned he's going to go golfing. He didn't mention anything about sitting in his office, lighting a candle and playing peaceful, calming tunes. I feel like that was a lot of him in his first year. It seems like that ship has sailed a little bit for him as he goes into his second season as the team's head coach. Expectations obviously high here going forward here. But Broncos Country, one thing we are going to talk about here today, before all the players get out, who are some standouts in the final practice and who's got some momentum going into training camp? We'll tell you why on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos. Several players have stood out throughout OTAs and mandatory minicamp, but as the team wrapped up their final practice on Wednesday in Dove Valley, it was Ja'Quan McMillian and David Sills who stood out on a short practice afternoon. Obviously, as Denver looks to march forward into training camp fully healthy here. And once again, I want to say thank you once again to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. You can get Locked On Broncos for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast here. Well, Sayre, let's kind of really get into this whole vibe now. Obviously, as we've talked about the offense not being as sharp in the final mandatory minicamp practice, quarterbacks not as sharp as they were previously in several practices. They're going into the offseason with some nice momentum. And I think for the most part here, Sayre, they're relatively healthy. And I think before we get into the standouts here in terms of who looked good, I feel like we should definitely touch on the injury report a little bit. Josh Reynolds pulled up, I guess, yesterday in practice and did not, had a little bit of a strain, according to Sean Payton. That's why we did not see him in the final Wednesday mandatory minicamp practice that the Broncos held there at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. But we also did not see Greg Dulcich, who we were hoping to see. Adam Troutman still off on the side, not really doing side field work, but more importantly, just like standing around as a veteran guy. Sean Payton called it like a core muscle injury, but more of a strain, something that doesn't require surgery, which is great news. And then Audric Estime, got to see him as well out there on the side field. He was wearing a jersey. He was wearing a wrap on his leg, and he was walking around fine. So I think that timeline for him to be ready for the start of training camp is here. A little disappointing, though. We did not get to see Greg Dulcich overall here at practice. Now I think the timeline now accelerates. Day one of training camp. Is Greg out there? If he's not, there's a lot of pressure that kind of builds with that, Sayre.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure on Greg, and certainly would make you wonder, like, hey, while Sean Payton's out there golfing, is he going to be calling the agents of some tight ends? Because I know the Broncos brought in Felipe Franks for a tryout, and of course, at this point, don't think they've signed anybody, at least as far as we know. But Felipe Franks is a quarterback who turned into a tight end, and I know we know some stories about Sean Payton and guys like that. So
I will say this, though. He had some trouble getting acclimated to the altitude, and it was hot. So Felipe, not the greatest start during his mini camp appearances.
It's tough for Felipe. I mean, he's used to that Florida, that humid heat. So it's a big difference, isn't it? But I'm just saying, guys like that, if Sean's going to be calling up agents of people and saying, hey, like, we need some help at tight end. I know he shouted out Thomas Yasmin, the undrafted free agent out of Utah, who is apparently the team's international program player this year, which is a cool thing that they're able to do with that. So they're able to have 91 players on the roster as opposed to 90 all offseason, which is great. So, but that's a situation that makes you wonder, doesn't it, with Greg Dulcich, of whether or not, hey, Sean's got to call up some agents for tight ends or maybe seek out a trade for a tight end. I mean, you want to be able to bank on Lucas Kroll. You want to be able to bank on Adam Troutman. But if Dulcich, I don't know, it feels like they're in a spot where they might have to start thinking of some contingencies. You kind of see the tip of the iceberg there with bringing in a guy like Felipe Franks, and maybe that is just the tip of the iceberg. So we'll have to wait and find out. But sounds like, Cody, from your practice report that I watched, which great job on that, obviously, sounds like there were a couple of other offensive standouts, though, at practice, even though it wasn't maybe necessarily their best day overall.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the offense kind of took what they were, given a little bit. You saw a lot of passes to running backs out of the backfield. Jaleel McLaughlin, once again, continuing to look like the best all-around back here for the Broncos in terms of running the football and even just catching the ball out of the backfield. He wanted a more prominent role, and then he came up to Sean Payton toward the end of last season and said, hey, send me some dang cut-up, Sean. I want to be able to get more involved as a receiver. I think there's a real good chance we're going to see a little bit more of that here with, obviously, Jaleel. And the thing I'm excited about with him is he does look not bigger, right? But it looks like he put on a little bit more muscle in comparison to last year. Last year, there was a lot of skinniness. You're looking at his body type right now. You see a little more muscle mass in the quads and also on the triceps. And so, hey, it's like bigger, bulkier. Can he maintain and do something with that? And what's the vision here for that position? That's going to be another interesting competition that plays out. I have to give a shout out, though, to David Sills, the fifth. And look, a guy who was really on the practice squad last year, got called up several times in terms of practice squad to active roster elevation on game day. He has had a consistent under the radar practice, routine. Like, this is a guy who's constantly running routes the right way. He's hitting it at the depth that Johnny Moe likes when they do routes on air, and he's catching everything. And on the afternoon, he had a really good catch during the team period. He was working against Riley Moss in coverage, and Jarrett Stidham, or it was Zach Wilson. Zach Wilson's best throw so far of the offseason period. It was a high point throw to the outside toward the sideline. David Sills went up two hands, got it, tiptoe, toe drag swag, got it in tightly contested coverage. He has had a really, really good training camp. And obviously, we're really going to be focused on Cortland, Tim, Marvin, Josh Reynolds. And obviously, we're talking about Troy Franklin, Devon Vele, Jalen Virgil having a great offseason as well. But David Sills and Michael Bandy, Jalen Virgil, these are three guys that were on the roster at some point last year that are having a really good offseason. They're not going to go away quietly. So for me, I look at that wide receiver room, and I don't envy the people that have to make the decisions and when it's time to trim down the roster. If all these guys stay healthy, I think you're going to have some very difficult decisions to make. David Sills, obviously, a standout there on the offensive side of the ball, but there was another guy on the defensive side of the ball who's been a consistent standout from day one of the offseason program. Ja'Quan McMillian, once again, stepping up, making plays in the red zone period, first team O versus first team D. Bo Nix threw a beautiful pass to Brandon Johnson in the end zone. Would have been kind of like that pylon out route. You're going to catch it. It's going to be a touchdown. Brandon Johnson got two hands on it, Sayre, and it looked to go crowd in. Ja'Quan came through, punched it out, knocked it away incomplete. He's had a really good offseason. I had a chance to catch up with him for a one-on-one interview after practice on Wednesday, and he's just so excited. He said there's so much more that he's learning now. He's found confidence in the fact that the playbook and the scheme is still the same. So for him, he feels like he's now carrying over what he did last year, and he's learning even more on top of that, especially with the addition of Jim Leonard. So he's excited about that as well.
We heard a number of players talk about that, didn't we? I mean, Alex Singleton talked about that a couple days ago, and I believe Quinn Miners even said something as well about having carryover and how helpful that is to not be learning a new system offensively or defensively, and how much confidence that gives you as a player to just go out there and perform, right? And I think that is an underrated aspect of this offseason for the Denver Broncos. There hasn't been a lot of continuity in Denver in recent years. I mean, even with, head coaches sticking around for multiple years, there hasn't been a lot of continuity in terms of offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators, things like that. Major coaching positions that are consistently changing, schemes consistently changing. I think guys are going to be able to play a little bit more, faster, free, and able to go out there and do a little more doing and a little less thinking, and help these young players in their development along the way, because that experience is so huge when it comes to. We talked I heard Alex Singleton answer. I don't know if maybe it was your question, Cody. You asked him about playing with Josie and how it is going to be different with, having somebody else there when you guys have such good nonverbal communication. And he's kind of just like, it's going to be easier because of that fact, because I'm not learning a new defense at the same time. And you can trust these other guys who have been in the same defense as well. So I think that there is tremendous value in that, and it's going to make everybody better. Ja'Quan McMillian, obviously, being somebody who is benefiting greatly from that. And then you add just a little twist from somebody like Jim Leonard, the new pass game coordinator on that side, secondary coach. And he's going to add just a little twist in there that you're not going to have to relearn an entire defensive scheme, but you're going to have a new coach that's giving you this perspective and teaching you something new and teaching you how to do something different that makes you better. That doesn't make it harder or more complicated.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's about keeping it simple and keeping it efficient. And it seems like there's a lot of good communication going on. And sometimes I think it's good to over-communicate, especially when you talk about defensive side of the ball. This was a great offseason program here for the Broncos. And look, there's a lot of excitement in the fan base, a lot of enthusiasm and optimism, and rightfully so. Like, if you feel it, you should feel it. I understand if there's some cautious skepticism, at times, because Broncos fans have dealt with this for 8 years, understandably so. but it's okay to be excited in the moment. In this offseason program, you have a young team. The one realization I came with, there's a lot of young players, a lot of young voices that are now taking the mantle, and they're going to lead this upcoming season. That could take some time, or it could thrive right away. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we can guarantee you we're going to be here every single step of the way here with all of you in Broncos country, all the everyday listeners that watch on YouTube or listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Even though that the Broncos offseason program is officially over before training camp, we still have episodes for you every single day here, Locked On Broncos. In the next coming weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, you're going to start getting training camp position previews, some of the biggest questions and storylines for this team as we build up to training camp, and things that this team needs answered ahead of the season. You can expect that and much more on Locked On Broncos. And for tomorrow's episode of the show, we're going to go through 3 standouts that we saw consistently the most during the Broncos offseason program. Who's built the most stock going into things? We'll break that down and much more in tomorrow's brand new episode of the show. We'll see you then.